When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, bought spices so that they may go and anoint him. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. They had been saying to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance to the tomb?" When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled back. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were amazed. But he said to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid.
My sermon this morning on this Resurrection Sunday, where we celebrate the risen Christ, it begins with this thesis, or this fact, if you will, that we've been gifted by God, or you might say by nature, with a wonderful piece of equipment, if you will, biological equipment that rests above our two eyes, which is the brain. Specifically, we have this large region called the cerebral cortex, the part that thinks and analyzes and imagines. It's the place where stories are formed. This gift of imaginative storytelling is both a blessing and a curse, depending on what stories we choose to cultivate. We either create stories that give life, or we gravitate to stories that lead to death. In fact, my thesis this morning suggests that we live and die by the stories we tell ourselves. Theologians call these meta-narratives, or big stories, archetypal stories, stories that shape and inform us in how we view the world and thus respond within the context of our own unique personal stories. These archetypal stories map out how we imagine the world and in return guide us in how we behave and act in the world. All religious traditions have some kind of meta-narrative around which they organize. The central meta-narrative around which the Christian faith is formed is the narrative of the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. To clarify, let me say the term resurrection from a Christian perspective is the idea that Jesus, after being tried, convicted, crucified, and laid to rest in a tomb, was, after 3 days dead, raised to a new life and appeared physically to his disciples and others before being taken up to heaven. A matter of legend or history is for you to decide. Whatever was made of the event of Jesus' life, the story of resurrection is told in all four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And when a story is repeated in all four Gospel versions, it says something about the centrality of the story that requires our attention. Something extraordinary occurred, perhaps. And the fact that all four Gospels tell the story is basically the same way, yet with recollection of differing details, is further evidence, some people say, of the story's authenticity. Mark, the oldest of the Gospels, is the earliest intact manuscript. In the earliest intact manuscripts, ends abruptly where we heard this morning in chapter 8. It says, "The women who discovered the empty tomb were afraid and told no one." I like this earliest version because it leaves the story open-ended, as if to say, now you, the listener, go and finish the story. You take ownership and run with it. Continue it out into the world. Matthew's version gives us the post-resurrection marching orders, where Jesus' last words on earth were, "Go out into the world and make disciples, teaching them all I have commanded you." Luke tells how the resurrected Jesus opened the minds of his disciples in the breaking of the bread while on the road to Emmaus. And Jesus is seen and known in the coming together through conversation and the breaking of bread. John's gospel seems to want us to know that the resurrection was physical. The physicality of the post-resurrected Jesus seems important in John's telling. In John's gospel, the disciple Thomas, upon hearing that Jesus is alive, must first touch the wounds before he can believe. Later in John's gospel, Jesus appears on the lakeshore and sits down to eat fish with his friends, as if to say, mere ghosts or spiritual concepts do not eat fish and break bread. Every Easter Sunday, when I am privileged to preach on the centrality of the resurrection, I recognize that the gathered assembly consists of a broad spectrum of beliefs regarding this story. To some, the story is metaphorical. To others, including apparently the Apostle Paul, it makes no sense unless it is historically and literally true. In saying this, I recognize that people come out in different places in how they relate to the Jesus story. And that's okay. Denise Levertov, a poet, wrote a poem called "On the Belief in the Physical Resurrection of Jesus." It says, "For it is for us all, literalists of the imagination, poets or not, that miracle is possible and essential. Are some intricate minds nourished on concept as epiphytes flourish high in the canopy? Can they subsist on the light of the half of metaphor that's not grounded in dust, grit, carnal clay? Do signs contain and utter for them all the reality that they need? Resurrection for some, an internal power, but not a matter of flesh. For others, of whom I am one, miracles, ultimate need, bread of life, are miracles just because people so tuned to the humdrum laws, gravity, mortality, can't open to symbols' power unless convinced of its ground, its roots in bone and blood. We must feel the pulse in the wound to believe that with God all things are possible. Taste bread at Emmaus that warm hands broke and blessed." For myself, I choose on most days to be in Levertov's camp. But whether one believes in the resurrection as metaphor or as historical reality that points to metaphor, the issue still is always one of meaning. The big cosmic so what? Regardless of where one falls on the question of literal historicalness, one is still required to ask the question, what does it mean? So what? How does Jesus rising from the dead make a difference? I suppose I state the absurdly obvious when I say that all of us are here this morning because we are alive. That said, many of us have aches and pains and challenges we suffer with And I know some of you have had close brushes with death through circumstances of illness and accident. When I, too, experienced one of those near-death stories a number of years ago, I had the opportunity to consider in a new way the story of Christ's resurrection. At Sacred Heart Hospital in Spokane, in every room is an icon of the resurrected Jesus, transcendently resurrected in front of a cross. Not crucified, resurrected. As a Christian, I've always valued this image, the ultimate victory of life over death. The message, Jesus is alive. Death is powerless before the power of life. To me, the message is clear. God is not mocked, and life is not defeated by any cruelty we human beings may cast upon one another. But none of this translated to me as I lay in the hospital. The central symbol of my faith did not speak to me when you might think it would speak loudest. But then, when I think about it, everything then was pretty flat. I had little to no interest in food. People brought me books to read or would read to me, but I had no interest. Everything on TV was absurd. Every channel was some story involving a gun or explosions or fear, tension, and conflict. Or there would be channels dedicated to some silly reality show where people were constantly competing or squabbling or some family of hillbillies who sell duck calls were discussing the best way to blow up a beaver dam. All these seem so empty and absurd when you're laying there in a bed. Maybe not living, maybe somewhere between living and not living. But when I couldn't conceive of the resurrection, or when it did not bring me comfort as a theological or meta-narrative, it came to me. It came to me in the care and love of my family, who were there in the most profound ways. It came in the form of prayers and gestures and mindfulness of many, many friends. Powerful prayers of supplication, prayerful beyond mere words. Resurrection came in the nurses and the doctors, the aides, the technicians, the chaplains, and other caring folk who focused their best skills and energy toward keeping me, one privileged middle-aged white guy on this planet for another few decades, presumably. I don't have to be, or we don't have to be, in a medical or existential crisis to realize that the story of the resurrection is a powerful narrative. This narrative declares to the world that the very force of the cosmos is within, is before, is around, is much bigger than us. It is a part of us. Resurrection calls out and calls us back again. Resurrection never lets death and suffering have the last word. Jesus lived it, Jesus taught it, and Jesus proved it. Resurrection is a powerful thing, and that is why Jesus didn't say, stay on the cross. That is why the tomb is empty, and that is why the angel says, go and find him. He is risen. For many summers now, I've worked at the church camp that the Mennonites run out of Leavenworth. I enjoy especially working with the junior high levels because they're asking great questions at that age. At one of the campfire talks, I shared how a number of years past, at one of the camps, Roger, the camp manager at the time, had a good quality telescope. And with some help from his phone app, Roger was able to zero in on this vast, infinite universe that is out there. And he was able to zero in on two spiraling galaxies that were visible in one lens. Galaxies containing billions of stars and planets. I reminded the kids that the nearest spiraling galaxy, the Andromeda galaxy, is over 3 million light years away. Furthermore, there are reported to be billions of these galaxies within the known universe. Furthermore, there are thought to be multiple dimensions of realities we cannot perceive. And as if this were not enough to grab our attention and strike our hearts with awe, it is said that only 4% of the matter in the universe is perceivable, leaving 96% to be labeled, as I said a couple of Sundays ago. And I may have my facts a little skewed, but I believe the rest is called dark matter. I believe again, like I said, I think I made mention of that, and I know there are people who would know way more about such matters than I do, so it's based on a layperson's reading of physics, I guess. In light of these and other observations, though, it would seem that the resurrection of Christ may not be so hard to consider. My point of mentioning the vast and mysterious universe we live in is to these junior high kids at summer camp, as well as to you this morning, is to get us to believe and celebrate and find courage in the reality that we are a part of a very, very large and mysterious, God-ruled, God-centered story. The story of the Christian tradition is one of mystery and the victorious power of love. It is a story of life over death. It is one of hope and the embrace of a God who cannot be defeated and will not let go, no matter what the apparent evidence of the momentary catastrophes may seem to indicate. And how, you may ask, can one judge whether one's story or narrative is a story of resurrection? You may consider this: resurrection stories are always about hope and never about fear. Resurrection stories are about thriving and not just surviving. They are about sharing as opposed to accumulating and consuming. Resurrection stories are always about creativity and risk-taking. Resurrection stories are stories about cooperation, unity, compassion, and tolerance. Resurrection stories always defy the world's tired, old, dysfunctional stories of win, lose, dog eat dog, us versus them, and everyone for themselves. When you read the Gospels through the lens of resurrection, you begin to see the world through the lens that God sees. I recently listened to someone I know and respect relay to me a story from her work. She was in a year-long volunteer program and was just out of college. And she wasn't happy in her placement, but she was sticking it out. But during this time, she asked her boss, with whom she was a volunteer, for a little flex time for one afternoon a week in order to do some hands-on work related to her future vocational interests. Her boss, who by her management style had already displayed little respect for this volunteer, said in response to this modest request for flexibility, "That's not how things work in the real world." To that banal reply, I say, as one who believes in the truth of the resurrection, that's just garbage. Much of what we call the real world is a construct of our own making. That's just how the world works, is far too often used to justify fear of adaptation and openness. Resurrection says other worlds do exist. Other possibilities can be pursued. Other ways of relating to this tired world are possible. Stories of the devil, if you will, are often the ones that resign us to believe that's just the way the real world works. As one who identifies as a pastor, a husband, a father, and most fundamentally as a human being, who has the privilege of taking up space on this planet for this momentary period of time, I will tell you about the real world I live in. I live in a world of inconsistencies, context, nuance, paradox, mystery, and yes, hypocrisy and sin. And with none of these conditions should we rest easy, especially the sin and hypocrisy. Nevertheless, this is the world I live in, and the only effective and honest and humble way I can move through it is by trusting in the victory, power, and grace of the resurrection story. There is no room for fear and pettiness in this story. God's story, the one that ultimately counts, is a story where resurrection is the final word. A friend of mine recently was facing a long engagement with cancer. And I know many of you have had similar challenging encounters with this disease. And you may have been given this poem, which I apologize if you have and maybe it didn't speak to you, but to me it was powerful and it relates to my message. So instead of using the word cancer, I will insert the word crucifixion. Crucifixion is so limited. It cannot cripple love. It cannot shatter hope. It cannot corrode faith. It cannot destroy peace. It cannot kill friendship. It cannot suppress memories. It cannot invade the soul. It cannot steal eternal life. It cannot conquer the spirit. Crucifixion is so limited. If there is any message to be taken away when we consider this story of Easter resurrection, may it be a message that informs us that death, be it spiritual death or literal death, is never the last word. Life is. Let us live as a people of life.